Every year, my family and I take a yearly vacation as part of us being able to spend time together. Usually it's to a beach house that's owned by our cousins. While it's nothing fancy, it's still something we love to do together. Well, the year before I went to college out of state, we decided to go one last time, since I knew that I wouldn't really have the time to go often after that. We left and made our way there. On the first night there, everyone else seemed to be exhausted, so I told my parents that since they were sleepy, they could stay in, and I was just going to go and venture out by myself. They weren't too concerned since we'd been here often, and I knew the way around. I headed out, and after driving, I found a nightclub that looked like it was busy enough. I parked and paid the fee to get in. Walking in, I was immediately overtaken by the loud noises and bass vibrating off the floor. Not knowing exactly where to begin, I just sort of slipped into the background. I hadn't been there long when I noticed someone coming up beside me. It was a man. He looked to be a little older than me, and I noticed he was holding a beer in his hand. As if it were effortless, he leaned up against the wall and flashed me a smile. I returned it, and he introduced himself as Vic. We talked for a while, and when he offered me a drink, I declined. Sure, I'd drank before, but I didn't feel like doing it right then. He seemed to be fine with that, and we moved on. We talked about things from what we like to do to family, and before long it seemed like hours melted by. He seemed pleasant, and he lacked a dangerous aura, so when he asked if I wanted to take a walk, I was fine with it. We made our way to the beach and took a nice stroll back towards the beach house. Before we got too close though, I told him this was my stop, just so he wouldn't know exactly where I was staying. I didn't even have time to register what happened next, but he kissed me. Surprisingly, I kissed back. We exchanged numbers and I went on my way, stopping to make sure he too had also left. Since we were staying for a week and a half, me and Vic hung out often. If I wasn't with my family, we'd be out just walking around. Heck, I even let him join us when we went to a nearby amusement park. Even there, he was as polite as can be. While he wasn't super muscular, he was definitely toned, and his dark hair made his dark brown eyes seem even more so. I'm pretty sure my mom was even stricken by his looks. They also liked how he was well-mannered. After a solid week of talking and hanging out, I knew that my time here was about to be over, and I would have to head back to the real world soon enough. That was why I never thought to take it further than a kiss. I also explained early on that this was a vacation, and I wouldn't be here for long. He seemed to understand. I soon found out that likely wasn't the case, except I found it out in likely the worst way possible. It all started 2 days before going back to the real world when we had been out on the beach. He had offered to teach me to surf, and I was thrilled. I had always loved the idea of it. While we were out there, I casually mentioned that I was leaving in 2 days, and he seemed bummed, but I assured him we could still text. As if it were nothing, he laughed a little bit before telling me that I could always stay there. Skip college. It would be pointless when I could have a happy life there, with him. The laugh made me think he was kidding, so I laughed with him and diverted the attention back to surfing. After a brief lesson, Vic suggested that we actually attempt to go into the water this time. I wasn't sure yet since I had just started, and we had all day. He insisted, bolstering my confidence. Ignoring the sinking pit in my stomach, we set out into the waters. Despite my apprehension, we kept going further and further out. Finally, I realized that we had left the shore behind us. On the board, we saw a wave coming up in the distance. He gave me a quick smile and said something about having my back. Both of us paddled out towards it and stood up. I felt ready, and for a brief moment, I thought everything was going to be fine. It wasn't until I was right at the wave that I realized this was too big for a beginner. I panicked. The wave slammed into me and sent me barreling into the salty water. I hit it with enough force that it knocked the air out of me. I barely managed to hold my breath before being pulled under the water. As I came up, I thought things were okay. I managed a quick inhale before I felt something else. This time, it wasn't something pulling me down from below. I felt hands pushing me down from above. I struggled to grasp what was happening, but then it hit me. Vic planned this. He wanted this to happen. I flailed until I felt my lungs burning. Then, all at once, I was back above water. I felt hands dragging me up. When I surfaced, it was Vic. I felt numb and confused all at once. I peppered him with questions such as what in the world just happened, but he insisted that he had been trying to pull me up the entire time. I felt like I was being gaslit thoroughly. By the time we made it to shore, he almost had me convinced. Except that he had a sinister look about him. I was unsettled. Suddenly, he felt dangerous. He offered me lunch when we made it to dry land, but I quickly made an excuse that I had to go. Back at my beach house, I locked myself indoors. I was shaken enough that I didn't even want to go to dinner that night and opted to stay in. As soon as they left, I locked myself inside and closed every blind in the place. I even kept the TV off for good measure, instead hiding in my room with my cell phone and watching Netflix that way. It felt safer than being outside suddenly. It was about 30 minutes after my parents left that I heard the knocking. I had no idea how he knew where I was staying precisely, but judging by the reaction at the ocean earlier, I figured he'd just followed me without my knowledge. Not wanting to let him know I was inside, I kept quiet. He continued to beat on the door, and I heard him yelling. When I wasn't answering, he started to call me. When I hit ignore, he sent a text that chilled me. He knew I didn't go to dinner. I froze. Seconds later, I heard what sounded like him kicking the door. Throwing caution to the wind, I ran and slid a side table in front of the front door. I took a quick peek out the peephole, and I saw what looked like a gun on his hip. I called 911 right away, before texting my dad for help too. Honestly, I didn't care who got there first. I just locked myself in the bedroom and slid down the wall, hoping whoever it was made it before he somehow got inside. I cried happy tears when the cops arrived first. From inside the house, I heard screaming to get on the ground before the operator told me that a cop would knock 3 times. When I heard the knocks, I double-checked before opening it, and sure enough, a cop stood at the door. Vic was handcuffed and practically being dragged down the sidewalk. The officer took a statement and listened as I explained. He even stayed till my parents arrived. As he was leaving, the other guy came up and explained that they also found a rope and duct tape in his car. The realization of what could have happened hit me like a Mack truck. We didn't even wait to leave. My parents threw everything in a bag that night and we went home without a second thought. The next vacation we went on ended up being in a totally different state and a totally different beach. I also never attempted any particular friendship on that one either. When I was a freshman in high school, I used to do odd jobs for extra cash. I used to get made fun of by my friends for babysitting, since I was a jock-looking tough guy, but cash was cash, and the kids I watched weren't too bad. The summer after my freshman year, I was approached by the mother of one of the kids I babysat for. She was taking her family on vacation and wanted to know if I could house sit. She told me she had a cat that I'd never seen since she was shy, and had a couple of plants that needed to be misted with a spray bottle a couple of times a week. It was easy money, and the homeowner allowed me to sleep over and have some friends stay some nights to keep me company since it was my summer break. Since my parents weren't the best, I was desperate for a safe place to sleep. At first, everything was fine. I woke up, left food out for the cat even if she never ate, misted the few plants, and then went about my day. I worked out in their indoor gym, another perk, and then at night I ordered pizza and played video games all night. But then, about 5 days into my stay, something odd happened. I had just gotten off the phone with the homeowner when the bell rang. It was late into the night, but I assumed it was maybe my girlfriend who finally had a moment to come over to stay the night with me. But when I opened the door, it was a delivery man with a pizza. I told him I didn't order a pizza, but he told me my client had paid for it already. When I opened the pizza box, it was my exact order. I was creeped out at first, until I remembered I'd told my client I was going to order a pizza. And since the place I ordered from was the closest shop and was one of their most popular pies, I didn't think anything of it. The next day, I invited my friends over for a movie night when I burnt my hand making snacks. I got a text a second later from the homeowner saying, "Forgot to mention, in case of an emergency, there's a first aid kit under the kitchen sink." At the time, I didn't think anything more of it. I guess what they say about guys not reading signs was right. That night, the house was freezing. The owner called me in the middle of the night and asked me to take out the laundry in the dryer. I did as she asked, and luckily for me, the laundry room had plenty of extra blankets folded, so I grabbed one. Flash forward to the next day, and my friends were staying the night, and, surprise, 10 pizzas were delivered. I told my friends, and they all were understandably creeped out. My best friend at the time assured me that I must have mentioned them coming to my client when I was on the phone earlier. We spent the entire night drinking, eating pizza, and watching cheesy horror movies like we were at a summer camp that none of our families could afford. But then, a couple of days before the family was coming home, I got a text I couldn't ignore. I had just gotten out of the shower and forgotten that I had run out of clean towels. I eyed my dirty t-shirt for a moment, debating on using it to dry off or just to put my clothes on while I was still wet, when my phone buzzed with a text. A text that said if I needed more clean towels, they would be in the closet in the guest bathroom. Yeah, I was dense, but I wasn't that dense. I quickly grabbed a towel and hurried to get back to my own house for the night. My client texted me the same day, asking me if anything was wrong. I ignored the message, but the next day, after I changed out the cat food that was still full, the owner asked if I was staying the night. I ignored the messages. When the family was back, I went over to collect the last of my pay and to tell them I couldn't babysit for them ever again. I was going to make up some BS excuse like I wanted to focus on my grades. I saw the little girl first, so I asked her if she missed her cat. She frowned at me with a confused expression and said, "We don't have a cat, silly." I stood, frozen, and didn't know what to say. So I asked about the plants I was missing, and she laughed, telling me that they were fake and that her mother had just bought them the week before. Putting everything together, I left their place without saying another word. I felt bad, but I could not see her mother, knowing that she lured me to her home with a fake story just to, watch me? I found the rest of my pay for house sitting in the mailbox along with a note, but I threw the note away, not wanting to read what the little girl's mother had to say. And, too embarrassed and unsure what to do, I stayed quiet and didn't say anything to anyone, not even my girlfriend. Still, I haven't been back to that house, and I no longer house sit, not knowing if I'm watching or being watched. I've been a teacher for 30 years. I love my job, and I've had some amazing students, but I always look forward to the long summer vacation. Because I'm a widow, I can travel pretty much wherever I want. This year, I decided to rent a tiny cottage on an island off the coast of Maine. I chose the smallest, most remote island I could find because I didn't want to deal with a crowd of summer tourists. I wanted peace and quiet. As soon as I settled in, I knew I'd chosen the right place. The island had less than 100 people, all locals. There was a single street in the middle of the island with one shop and one restaurant. That was about it. My first week there was very relaxing. Aside from 2 short trips to the shop, I didn't interact with anyone. I just sat on the beach and read. It was wonderful. Then, one evening, right before sunset, there was a loud knock at my front door. I thought it was the wind, so I didn't answer. But when I looked out the window, I could see the silhouette of a child standing outside my door. He was frozen, waiting for something. I felt a shiver down my back, but I knew I had to answer the door. Maybe this kid was in trouble. So I opened the door and saw who it was. I almost screamed. He was a little boy, about 6, with very dark hairs and pale skin. He looked identical to a student of mine from 30 years ago during my first year of teaching. Martin Jennings was his name. Back then, he was a troubled kid who didn't have any friends because his classmates were scared of him. When our class hamster died, I knew that Martin had done it, though I never found any evidence. By the middle of the year, Martin had become completely unhinged. He gave another student a concussion, so we had to expel him. But he came back to the classroom that night and set fire to the curtains. There was a big hearing about it. I had to testify against him, and he ended up being sent to a mental health facility. After that, I didn't know what happened to him. But this was 30 years ago. The real Martin would have been nearly 40 now. This boy couldn't be the same person, and yet they looked identical. The boy stared at me for a long moment and then whispered, "Hello, Miss Scott." My heart almost stopped. That was my maiden name. I hadn't used it in decades. "Who are you?" He smiled and said, "I think you know." Then he turned around and walked back toward the beach. I watched him disappear into the darkness. That night, I couldn't sleep. I tried to convince myself that I'd just imagined the boy or even dreamt it, but deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. He was there, unchanged after all these years. The next morning, I went outside to drink my coffee, and I saw that someone had painted a giant red X on the side of my cottage. I walked straight into town. There were no police on the island. The best I could do was talk to the owner of the market, who acted like the island's de facto mayor. I told him what happened, and he assured me that there were no children on the island. He asked if I'd gotten enough sleep. He didn't believe me. He refused to even look at the graffiti on my wall. With no one else to turn to, I went back to the cottage and prayed that the boy wouldn't come back. I stayed inside all day, making sure that my doors and windows were all locked. That night, the boy returned. I could hear him walking around the house, giggling and throwing pebbles at my windows. "Go away!" I screamed, but that just made him giggle louder. Eventually, he stopped. I couldn't hear anything except the wind. Hours passed, and I decided that I'd take a boat back to the mainland in the morning. I couldn't be on this island any longer. By about 3 a.m, I was finally able to get back to sleep. That didn't last long. I woke up coughing. My room was filled with smoke. Heat was coming from outside my bedroom door, and I realized that my cottage was on fire. Covering my mouth, I stumbled to the window, but it wouldn't open. I was losing strength. I knew that if I stayed in that room just a few minutes more, I'd suffocate. I grabbed a lamp from the end table and shattered the glass. With my last ounce of strength, I crawled through the window. Shards of glass cut into my stomach, but that didn't matter. I'd made it to safety. I could finally breathe. As I was gasping for air, I saw the boy watching me from a distance. But he wasn't alone. He was holding hands with a grown man. The man looked like an adult version of Martin, except half of his face appeared to be disfigured in some way. That's when I knew that the boy wasn't some ghost from my past. The boy was Martin's son. They walked closer. Soon, they were standing over me, looking down. The man held a jug of gasoline, ready to douse me with it. I didn't have the strength to stand up and run away. The only thing I could do was talk to him. Using my teacher voice, I shouted, "Martin, you're in big trouble. Go home right now." He didn't move. I knew he was going to burn me alive. But then, he tossed the jug onto the ground and started walking away. The boy followed him. Very soon, they were gone. By then, other islanders had noticed the fire. They gathered around me, missing Martin and his son by less than a minute. That was the last thing I remember before I passed out. I woke up in a hospital on the mainland. The doctor told me I'd be okay. A policeman was there to ask me questions. I gave him Martin's full name and told him everything that happened. He left the room to make some calls. When he came back, he said that my attackers couldn't possibly be Martin and his son. Martin Jennings had set fire to the mental hospital where he'd been committed 30 years ago. The reports said he had died in the fire, along with 3 other patients. The policeman promised me that they'd find out who tried to kill me, but I didn't believe that. I know Martin's still out there, and I pray to God that he doesn't come back for me.